Nicholas Foster didn't stand out when he first walked through the revolving glass doors of Bremen Logistics. He didn't carry the swagger of the young go-getters fresh out of Ivy League business schools, nor did he come with the awkward, bumbling energy of someone desperate to make a name. He entered quietly, respectfully, with a calm detachment that seemed almost indifferent, wearing a gray wool blazer that looked neither expensive nor cheap, his ID badge already clipped neatly to his belt. The receptionist barely noticed him as she buzzed him through to the intern orientation. In the elevator, he stood at the back, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the polished chrome walls with the kind of passive interest that didn't suggest ambition or anxiety. He looked like someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Bremen Logistics was not a place where interns made noise anyway. The company, a cornerstone in the highly controlled and often confidential world of defense, contracting, and international freight strategy, operated like a closed-circuit, hierarchical, procedural, and suspicious of novelty. Nothing about it screamed innovative, and it didn't need to. Its value was built on its reliability and discretion, not creativity or disruption. It was the kind of place where senior management used BlackBerrys long after the rest of the world moved on, where presentations were still printed on paper for security reasons, and where new people were expected to watch and wait, not speak and act. Nicholas was placed in Department 4C Operations Analysis and Contract Implementation. A mouthful of a name for what was essentially a logbook battleground where logistics planners, compliance officers, and mid-tier managers fought over timelines, contractor rates, pay and shipment clearance windows. His direct supervisor was Karen Larson, a department head with nearly 15 years of internal experience and the kind of managerial posture that could turn a status update into an inquisition. She was known for her sharp dress, sharper tone, and a near-clinical obsession with procedural perfection. Colleagues respected her for her results and feared her for everything else. To Karen, Nicholas presented no particular interest. She barely skimmed his intake summary, some generic HR note about educational background and program participation. No known industry referrals. No notable distinctions. Just another name in the intern pool rotation. When she met him in person that first morning, she mistook his reserved demeanor for shyness. When he hesitated before responding to her rapid-fire rundown of expectations, she marked him as slow. When he asked 2 clarifying questions about the document submission protocol, she noted them as inefficiencies. It took her less than 24 hours to decide she wouldn't be investing time in him. Just have him shadow Donnie, she told her assistant. Let him learn something by osmosis. If he's still here by next month, we'll let him touch the internal tracker. And so, Nicholas spent his days at a secondary desk in the corner of the shared space, positioned awkwardly between 2 filing cabinets and a printer that jammed every few hours. He said little, moved even less. He read quietly through binders, reviewed route logs, and occasionally tagged along with Donnie, a jaded analyst who had been with the company long enough to know better than to get involved in anything with long-term implications. Donnie was indifferent, which suited Nicholas fine. Nobody asked Nicholas to contribute. He wasn't included in planning huddles or war room sessions, and his presence barely registered in department briefings. He was the intern, and he understood the rules of the ecosystem he had entered. Still, Karen took note of the small things. She didn't like how he remained calm when others scrambled under pressure. She didn't like how he didn't try to impress anyone or network. He never asked for feedback, never tried to schedule a one-on-one. He didn't participate in the informal lunchtime banter or the awkward Friday celebration huddles. He wasn't rude, just separate. And people who separated themselves tended to either collapse or climb. Karen hated both types. She began delegating more menial tasks his way. She had him alphabetize printed contract logs from 4 years ago. She sent him to fetch binders from off-site storage without telling him there was a documented system for that. She had him attend internal webinars that had nothing to do with his department, just to keep him occupied. And still he complied without protest. That, more than anything, unnerved her. At some point during his third week, Nicholas reviewed a weekly supplier delivery report and noticed a discrepancy in a third-party transit authorization code. It was a small error barely worth mentioning. But the shipment in question was tied to a time-sensitive NATO logistics contract. An incorrectly filed code could result in a chain reaction of delays and security reevaluations. He quietly flagged it to Donnie, who gave a shrug and a muttered, "Yeah, happens all the time." Nicholas didn't escalate it to Karen. Technically, it wasn't his lane, and he wasn't even authorized to touch the procurement chain. Still, he copied the relevant data, marked the inconsistency, and passed it to Donnie's inbox. 2 days later, that same discrepancy reached security compliance. An internal note from the risk office was circulated, calling out the routing conflict. The issue was caught early enough to be corrected without penalties, but a note was logged. Karen was called into a video meeting to clarify her department's oversight procedures. It was tense, though no formal consequences followed. However, when she traced the paper trail and discovered that Nicholas had initially flagged the error, even informally, it triggered something deeper than irritation. She saw it as subordination cloaked in helpfulness. The intern had inserted himself into a technical field outside of his role, and in doing so, he'd drawn attention to a blind spot under her jurisdiction. In her mind, she was lucky the error didn't go higher. But the fact that he had spotted it and chosen not to inform her directly was unforgivable. She didn't yell. Karen was too polished for that. She simply informed Nicholas that his internship had been reviewed and that, due to insufficient performance and mismatch with departmental objectives, his placement was being concluded early. She printed the exit documentation herself, handed it to him with the practiced elegance of someone used to closing doors. "I don't think this environment is a fit for you, Nicholas," she said with professional finality. "But internships are about learning, and I'm sure you'll find the right direction moving forward." Nicholas took the paper, read it, and gave a small, polite nod. "I understand," he said simply. No anger. No rebuttal. Just an almost serene acceptance that struck her as strange. "You've been quiet since day one," she added, perhaps fishing for some recognition of his own inadequacy. "You never quite engaged." He met her eyes for the first time that day and replied calmly, "Sometimes that's the only way to learn how things really work." The sentence lingered in the room longer than it should have. She blinked, unsure whether it was a passive remark or something more deliberate. But she didn't ask. She just waved toward the door and turned back to her monitor. Nicholas left without further comment. No farewell to the team. No collecting of last day signatures. His desk was already clean. The elevator ride down was just as quiet as the one up weeks earlier. And with that, the intern was gone. Or so she thought. The next time Karen Larson saw Nicholas Foster, it was in the form of a name. She didn't immediately recognize it. The email came from a neutral account associated with Bremen's External Strategic Committee, a relatively new oversight group that had been formed after a large shareholder acquisition earlier in the year. The message was simple. To all department leads, please be available at 14 for an audit alignment meeting with strategic operations and external governance. It was signed, among others, by Nicholas Foster, senior advisor. For a moment, Karen simply blinked at the screen. She reread the name slowly, even hovered over the signature to see if there was some internal link or employee profile attached. There wasn't, just a clean, dry digital footprint. She stared at the name for a while, trying to recall whether there had been another Foster in the company, perhaps someone on the board, someone from legal or PR. But it tugged at her memory, like a half-remembered tune just out of reach. She finally pushed the thought aside and went on with her day. At precisely 2:00, Karen entered conference room B, already halfway into a conversation with her deputy about a packaging contract dispute. The room was fuller than expected. Most department heads were present, along with 2 legal observers and a few people she didn't immediately recognize, one of whom, Seated at the far end of the table with a closed black notebook and a still expression was Nicholas Foster. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes locked on his. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply sat and waited, composed, as if he'd always been there and she was the one entering his space. It hit her then, suddenly and without ceremony. It was him. The intern. The one she'd dismissed only weeks earlier. But the setting had shifted. He was no longer in that gray, wrinkled blazer. He wore a tailored navy suit, nothing flashy, but precise. His hair, previously unkempt in a casual way, was now neatly styled. Everything about him had tightened into a professional figure she didn't recognize, and yet unmistakably it was the same man. Her stomach fluttered with the smallest flicker of disorientation. Then came the confusion. What was he doing here? What was this meeting really about? The introduction was led by a senior partner from the governance committee, who thanked everyone for attending and explained the purpose of the visit: a scheduled evaluation of departmental alignment with the company's new post-merger charter, focusing specifically on leadership dynamics, procedural accountability, and the cultural climate within operations-heavy teams. In simple terms, it was an internal restructuring audit disguised as a collaborative review. Nicholas Foster, they said, would serve as the liaison between the board's operational subcommittee and internal leadership, overseeing both qualitative and procedural evaluations. Karen remained silent during the opening discussion. Her mind ran in circles trying to process the implications. She had fired this man weeks ago. Not reprimanded or suspended, fired with prejudice. She had signed the exit form herself, confident in her judgment that he was useless, slow, and mismatched. And now he sat across from her with a role that gave him more insight and oversight into her department than anyone had held in years. He never mentioned their prior interaction. Not once. Through the course of the 2-hour session, Nicholas spoke sparingly, asked pointed questions, and listened more than he spoke. He made no effort to engage her directly, though once or twice she could feel his eyes studying her, not personally, but professionally, like someone collecting information for a silent report. When the meeting ended, he stood, closed his notebook, and left without a word. Karen sat for another minute in her chair, her hand still holding the pen she hadn't used. That night, she went home and reread every email she had from HR, every departmental memo from the past month. There was no trace of how he had risen. No corporate announcement, no internal bulletin. Whoever had placed him there had done it outside the usual rhythm of personnel changes. That made it worse. It meant this wasn't just an employee returning with a promotion. It meant Nicholas had come back through a door she didn't even know existed. The following week, small but noticeable things began to happen. HR sent a notice about a new culture assessment survey requiring anonymous submissions from team members regarding their department's working environment. An analyst from data compliance scheduled a review of her routing protocols. Procurement flagged a contract she'd signed last quarter for reauthorization due to a miscompliance clause. None of these were direct attacks, but they all arrived within days of Nicholas' audit meetings. Still, he remained invisible outside of those sessions. He didn't linger around departments, didn't visit her floor, didn't call for follow-ups. Karen began to feel something she hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. It wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. Someone had placed him above her, or adjacent to her, in a structure she didn't fully understand, and nobody was explaining anything. She asked her contact in HR if she could see the background summary on Nicholas Foster, citing a need for clarity during interdepartmental reviews. She was told the file was restricted by board-level confidentiality. That was the moment she knew something bigger was in motion. Her mistake hadn't been firing an intern. Her mistake had been misjudging someone who had deliberately come in at the lowest rung, not because he lacked options, but because he wanted to observe the company from the inside. And worse, he had chosen her department to do it. She started reacting. She doubled down on performance reviews, restructured team workflows, reissued internal policy memos. She scheduled visibility meetings with adjacent teams to emphasize her proactive stance. But the more she pushed, the more resistance she began to sense, passive, quiet, but real. Staff took longer to respond. Fewer people volunteered for stretch assignments. Conversations in the hallway grew shorter when she walked by. One day she walked past the break room and heard her name drop in a sentence, then silence. She opened a cabinet later that week and found a stack of completed culture surveys. Someone had left a sticky note on top. It said only you should read what they say when it's anonymous. Her jaw clenched as she threw the stack in the shredder. And still, Nicholas said nothing. His silence was worse than any accusation. He didn't have to remind her of anything. The very fact of his presence was enough to destabilize everything she had built her authority on. His return was not an act of revenge. It was something colder, something more dangerous. He had come back not to correct a personal slight, but to evaluate a system, and she, in her arrogance, had made herself the perfect case study. Karen didn't sleep well that month. She kept the curtains in her office slightly drawn and avoided meetings she couldn't control. When Nicholas did speak during board reviews, it was with surgical precision, highlighting patterns of attrition, inconsistencies in policy application, leadership bottlenecks. He never once used her name. He didn't need to. The data spoke for itself, and she could see her influence bleeding away in metrics, charts, and anonymized feedback. Every time someone asked a question about leadership cohesion, she heard it as an accusation. Every time someone referenced team trust, she felt it as an indictment. She couldn't stop herself from trying to regain control, sending bullet-pointed updates, scheduling roundtables, volunteering for committees. But the more she acted, the more it became clear she was no longer trusted, not by the board, not by the staff, and not by the company's future. And still, Nicholas Foster never once reminded her who he was. But she remembered. Every day. By the time the second month of the internal audit cycle rolled around, Karen Larson had managed to convince herself that she was regaining control. Her public posture remained intact, firm, professional, authoritative, but internally, something had shifted. There was a constant tension in her jaw, a sense of waiting that never quite left her. Her calendar, once neatly segmented and structured, had begun to look chaotic. Meetings appeared without her knowledge, performance checkpoints popped up from adjacent departments, and she found herself copied on emails that read less like collaboration and more like warnings. Still, she refused to let it show. To lose poise now, with so many eyes on her, would only feed whatever silent narrative had begun to form around her name. And yet, for all her careful maneuvering, it only took one meeting to throw everything off balance. It was a routine operations forecast, one of those standing meetings designed more for box ticking than real strategy. Karen arrived early as usual, binder in hand, metrics memorized. She made small talk with the VP of Compliance, casually steered conversation toward non-audit subjects, subtly redirected focus from culture reports to client retention metrics. It worked for a while. The tone of the meeting was predictable, the questions polite. Then, near the end, Nicholas Foster, who had sat mostly silent throughout, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "I'd like to flag a pattern we've been seeing in Department 4C, he said in a voice that was calm but carried weight. We've been reviewing attrition logs over the past 5 quarters, and 4C has demonstrated the highest rate of unprompted staff turnover in the division. Not only that, but the time to replacement ratio is nearly 28% above the departmental average. That suggests not only higher exits, but slower recoveries. In a logistics chain, that's a vulnerability." Karen felt her stomach tense, but she didn't blink. She'd prepared for this. She smiled, nodded, tilted her head slightly like someone considering a student's naive question. "That number includes our rotating contractors," she replied. "They're seasonal, tied to short-term defense routing projects. It's a structural anomaly, not a cultural one." Nicholas didn't counter. He simply looked at the legal rep seated next to him, who opened a folder and passed it across the table. Inside were anonymous exit comments, pulled from the last 7 staff departures. Each had been stripped of identifying data, but the themes were identical. Toxic environment, unapproachable leadership, fear-based structure. One line read, "Nothing's ever good enough, and no one feels safe speaking honestly." Another, "There are no mistakes allowed, only punishments disguised as coaching." Karen's hands, perfectly manicured, pressed slightly into the table's edge, just enough to feel the texture of the wood. She didn't look at the pages. She didn't need to. She already knew what was in them. "I understand that any department can go through periods of pressure," Nicholas continued. "But what we're seeing here isn't isolated. It's directional. It reflects a managerial pattern." She met his eyes. There was no triumph there, no smugness. Just quiet precision. He wasn't there to accuse her personally. He was presenting the result of a system she had built and maintained with pride for over a decade. And now that system had become her liability. In the days that followed, she launched what she called a realignment initiative. A harmless term. Harmless to the untrained eye, at least. In practice, it meant reshuffling mid-level coordinators, pulling in a few loyal staff from old projects, and sidelining those she considered unstable or too comfortable with Nicholas. She scheduled feedback sessions that were thinly veiled interrogations. She requested updated documentation on team structure, reissued delegation protocols, and insisted on transparent weekly reporting, a euphemism for total control. The response was mixed. Some of her remaining loyalists responded with their usual robotic efficiency, but others began to falter. A senior analyst quietly requested a transfer. A longtime assistant took sudden medical leave. The energy in the room during meetings grew brittle, polite in the way that comes from obligation, not respect. And through all of it, Nicholas remained quiet, orbiting the edges of every major interaction without ever stepping directly into confrontation. What unnerved Karen more than anything was his restraint. It would have been easier if he had attacked her directly, lodged a formal complaint, or tried to corner her in meetings. But he didn't. He was methodical, strategic. His presence was like pressure under the floorboards, never seen but always felt. He continued requesting data, reviewing reports, speaking with her team, not about her, never about her, but always near her. She knew what he was doing. He was letting the cracks appear on their own. And worse, he was letting others see them. Then came the email from the chairman's office. A request for Nicholas Foster to conduct a targeted leadership development review of all mid- and upper-level managers and operations. It was presented as a strategic trust-building initiative, but Karen understood what it meant. He'd been given license to examine people like her. She responded formally, of course, welcomed the effort, suggested resources. But within the hour, she was already combing through her digital footprint, searching for anything that could be interpreted as harsh, unmeasured, or worse, vindictive. For the first time in her career, she began deleting things. Meeting notes, offhand Slack comments, scheduling messages she'd forwarded with sarcasm. She even pulled up the record of Nicholas's exit documentation, wondering if it had been worded too strongly. She was surprised to find it blank. Someone, perhaps legal, had purged it. There was no formal record of his termination at all. That's when she realized she hadn't just underestimated him, she had been playing a completely different game. One Thursday afternoon, she found herself walking past conference room A and caught a glimpse of Nicholas speaking with her division's EVP. Their posture was relaxed, conversational. There was laughter. The EVP nodded, shook his hand, and left. Nicholas lingered for a second, then looked up through the glass and caught her eye. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply looked. That same unreadable expression, focused, calm, and unapologetically present. Karen stood there for a full second longer than necessary, then turned and walked away. She needed air. Later that evening, she stayed late under the pretense of backlog clearance. The office was nearly empty. The fluorescent lights cast sterile shadows across the cubicles. She stood at the window of her office, watching the city lights blink behind the haze. In her hands, she held a copy of her own departmental audit from the previous year, glowing, spotless, untouched by controversy. And yet, it felt like a museum piece, a relic from a version of herself that no longer had relevance. She sat down, opened her laptop, and drafted an email to the governance committee. It was calculated half plea, half professional defense. She offered to volunteer for a company-wide onboarding revamp, citing her long-standing familiarity with cross-departmental frameworks. She attached a brief outlining her perspective on the recent survey results, hinting that they may reflect change fatigue rather than poor leadership. She didn't name Nicholas. She didn't need to. The message was clear. When she hit send, her hands were steady, but her breathing wasn't. For the first time in years, Karen Larson, the woman who had outlasted 3 leadership teams, survived 2 mergers, and risen from junior coordinator to department head, felt genuinely unsure about her place in the room. She had always assumed that authority protected itself, that seniority granted permanence, that results would speak louder than perception. But she had forgotten something crucial. Cultures change quietly. Reputations don't shatter, they dissolve. And sometimes the most dangerous threat isn't the loudest critic, but the silent observer who sees everything, waits for nothing, and moves exactly when it counts. Nicholas Foster had said nothing, but he had spoken more clearly than anyone else ever had. It wasn't a single event that signaled the shift, it was a series of quiet, deliberate moves that, when viewed together, made it clear the tide had turned. Karen Larson, once the unshakable anchor of Department 4C, began to notice that her footing was no longer firm. It started subtly. Meeting invites she used to issue were now being coordinated through central operations. Policy drafts she had previously approved without question began coming back with annotations, not from junior staff or peer managers, but from names tied directly to Nicholas Foster's new initiatives. The nature of her control was no longer absolute, and it was being challenged not with confrontation, but with procedure. She knew she was being managed, and it infuriated her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her career using structure to maintain power, and now that same structure was being turned inward. She couldn't call it sabotage, it wasn't. But it was unmistakably strategic. Nicholas had positioned himself not as a disruptor but as a reformer, and the company welcomed reformers. They didn't just tolerate him, they were beginning to respect him. That was the part Karen couldn't digest. It wasn't just that she'd underestimated him, it was that others hadn't. They'd known who he was or what he represented long before she connected the dots. When she finally learned the truth, it didn't come as a revelation, it arrived like a confirmation of a growing suspicion she had been trying to silence. She was in the executive elevator late one afternoon, leaving a quiet strategy session that had felt more like a pre-funeral than a meeting, when one of the finance VPs stepped in with her. He was polite, cordial, and unaware of the storm that lived behind her composed expression. As the elevator descended, he made a passing comment about the Foster realignment approach and how it reminded him of Nicholas's father, an old-school strategist who had believed in bottom-up observation and silent diagnostics before taking over any board position. Karen's expression didn't move, but something behind her eyes cracked. She asked nothing. The VP said nothing more. But when she stepped out of the elevator, she no longer had questions. She had confirmation. Nicholas wasn't just an external advisor. He wasn't some fast-track consultant flown in by board panic. He was legacy. His father had helped build Bremen from its foundation, and though his name had never been loudly marketed, his influence was part of the company's DNA. And now, years later, his son had returned not as a successor in name, but as a sleeper force operating from within, with the full weight of the board's quiet blessing. Karen felt sick. Not because she'd made an enemy of someone powerful, but because she'd done it so blindly. She had spent years believing that upward movement in the company was earned through visible loyalty, performance, and the ability to outlast competitors. She never imagined someone would willingly place themselves at the bottom just to watch how the machine ran when no one thought they were watching. Nicholas had walked through her front door disguised as the least consequential figure in the room, and she'd handed him everything he needed to understand exactly who she was and how she operated. That week, Karen attempted to regroup. She brought in a new assistant, young, aggressive, eager to prove himself, and began implementing a top-down communications refresh. She initiated pulse check meetings with lower-tier staff, trying to reframe herself as a present leader. But the tone was off. Her questions sounded rehearsed. Her presence felt forced. The problem wasn't the effort, it was the timing. Too much had already been seen. Too many decisions made behind closed doors. Her actions no longer felt like leadership. They felt like survival. Then came the board memo, a company-wide announcement of an internal transformation committee led by Nicholas Foster. It didn't mention her department specifically. It didn't need to. The language was clean: optimization, transparency, trust renewal. But the timing, the focus on culture, and the data sets they referenced, it was all built from the observations that had begun inside 4C. Karen read the memo 3 times. Her heart beat a little faster with each pass. The writing wasn't dramatic. It wasn't condemning. But it had finality to it. A tone that said, "The old way is done." She closed her laptop and sat in the darkening office. Outside, the city had turned gold, reflecting the last hour of sunlight. Her office, once the heart of her operation, now felt cold, disconnected. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was vacant. That Friday, Nicholas hosted his first town hall and open QA for department leads and managers. Karen debated not attending. She considered sending a proxy. But in the end, she walked into the room 10 minutes early and took a seat near the front. Not as a show of strength, but as a gesture of presence. She was still here. For now. The room filled slowly. The atmosphere was curious, not tense. Nicholas stood at the front, not behind a podium but level with everyone else. He spoke plainly, without flourish. He outlined the goals of the transformation initiative, the focus on rebuilding internal trust, and the importance of letting feedback shape structure, not just the other way around. He didn't name names. He didn't address the past. But Karen knew this was the pivot. The company was turning. During the open QA, someone asked how the committee would handle departments with entrenched leadership styles. It was a delicate way of asking about her. Nicholas didn't pause. "We're not here to dismantle individuals," he said. "We're here to examine systems. If the system rewards silence and punishes dissent, then we adjust the system. If people choose to evolve with it, they stay. If they resist, the choice becomes theirs." Karen felt the room lean in slightly, like a collective recognition of a line that was being drawn, gently but irrevocably. Nicholas wasn't threatening anyone. He was describing a future that had already begun. And in that moment, Karen realized something she had spent her whole career avoiding. She was not feared anymore. She was watched, measured, and that made her vulnerable. She left the room before the closing, quietly. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she felt the isolation settle like a weight across her shoulders. Not dramatic, just cold. She had walked in as a force and left as a relic. And Nicholas Foster had never raised his voice. The company had changed, but Karen Larson hadn't. At least not in the way others around her were hoping. There was a shift occurring across Bremen Logistics, one that was moving slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, but Karen wasn't ready to be part of it. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she didn't trust it. She had seen enough management fads come and go, enough cultural resets, dissolve into unstructured chaos, to believe that what Nicholas Foster was proposing was anything more than a polished dismantling of the hierarchy she had spent her life mastering. In her mind, what was happening now was not evolution, it was erosion. The subtle elimination of power disguised as collaboration. And she wasn't going to surrender to it quietly. Her strategy shifted. If she couldn't block the transformation, she would at least survive it and, if possible, steer it. She began identifying key decision-makers outside of the transformation committee. Not just direct power holders, but those who still moved things in the background, department heads nearing retirement, who had little patience for disruption, legal consultants who favored compliance over culture, and middle managers terrified that change meant irrelevance. She reached out under the pretense of unity, requesting feedback, offering to connect dots between the operational and strategic, promising to translate Nicholas's broader vision into something grounded in execution. It wasn't rebellion. It was positioning. And for a moment, it almost worked. Small alliances began to take shape. A finance coordinator quietly forwarded Karen an early draft of the next internal culture bulletin before it was approved. A project manager from infrastructure invited her to co-author a guidance memo on transitional efficiency. She began to feel the old rhythm returning, not control, not quite, but proximity to it. She attended committee briefings not with resistance, but with carefully crafted observations and compliments, playing the part of the cooperative legacy leader. It was a calculated mask, but a convincing one, until she made a mistake. In one of her private meetings with a nervous senior analyst, someone who had been wavering between loyalty and neutrality, Karen let her guard slip. She referred to Nicholas not by name, but by implication. This idea that culture can be manufactured from the bottom up, it's naive, she said. It's not leadership, it's theater. And people like that don't build companies, they destabilize them. What she didn't know was that the analyst had already spoken to Nicholas earlier that week. And while their conversation hadn't included direct criticisms of Karen, it had included an expressed fear that certain leaders might be trying to co-opt the process of transformation for their own agenda. The analyst didn't record the meeting. He didn't report her. But the next day, his request for a transfer was submitted and approved within 24 hours. Karen noticed his departure in the staff bulletin the following week. No message, no goodbye. He had simply vanished, and no one brought it up. That was the new rhythm, quiet exits, like subtle shifts in pressure before a storm. You didn't notice them until the room was already colder. That same week, Nicholas initiated Phase 2 of the realignment. It included the restructuring of 3 senior departments and the dissolution of several outdated management committees, including one Karen had chaired for 8 years. She didn't receive a call or a warning. Her removal was noted in a procedural memo, grouped with a list of other changes. She felt the sting not because of the position itself, but because of the message it sent: you are no longer essential. Her response was immediate. She requested a one-on-one meeting with the head of strategic governance. Not with Nicholas, that would be too direct, but with the individual who technically oversaw his committee. She framed her request as a clarification session. Her intent was different. In that meeting, Karen presented herself as concerned, not threatened. She spoke of her commitment to the company, of the danger of throwing out institutional memory in the name of agility, and of the need to ensure measured transitions. She stopped short of accusing Nicholas of anything, but the implication was there that someone with too much influence and not enough experience might be making broad decisions without understanding their downstream impact. The governance head listened, politely. He took notes. He asked no questions. Then he thanked her for her feedback and promised to pass it along. 2 days later, Karen received an email from legal. It was not disciplinary. It was, in fact, procedural confirmation that the Transformation Committee had completed their review of Department 4C's previous 5-year cycle and would be issuing recommendations. Karen wasn't copied on the content of the report. She was merely informed of its submission. What followed was a week of silence. She waited, checked her inbox too frequently, met with her team, tried to maintain the appearance of steadiness. But there was an edge in her voice now, a pressure beneath her skin that grew heavier by the hour. She was waiting for something she couldn't see, a judgment being passed in quiet rooms she was no longer invited into. And then it came. A scheduled meeting, marked private, with only one name attached, Nicholas Foster. She arrived early, as always. The room was small, tucked into a corner of the executive floor. Nicholas was already there, seated at a side table with no laptop, no papers, just a folder and a pen. He gestured to the chair across from him. Karen sat down, composed but alert. He didn't speak immediately. He waited, like someone giving space for formality to catch up with reality. Then he opened the folder and slid a single document across the table. It was a reallocation notice. Her role was being reassigned. Not eliminated, not demoted, but repositioned. Effective immediately, she would transition into a strategic advisor capacity, with a project scope focused on historical integration and legacy systems optimization. The language was neutral, almost gentle, but it was final. Karen read the document twice. Then she looked up and asked the only question that mattered. Was this your idea? Nicholas met her eyes and spoke without venom. It was a collective decision, based on the data and the direction we're moving in. She nodded slowly, processing the weight behind the softness of the words. He wasn't angry. He wasn't seeking vengeance. He was operating in a world where people didn't win arguments, they became irrelevant to them. I built that department, she said, quieter than she intended. I know, he replied. That's why this isn't a removal. It's a shift. The foundation remains, but it needs to evolve. For a moment, Karen wanted to push back, to explain, to fight, to reclaim something. But she couldn't. Not because she lacked the will, but because she understood. Nicholas wasn't her adversary. He was the embodiment of something she had refused to accept, that the game had changed, and the players now followed different rules. She signed the document. As she stood to leave, Nicholas offered her a final word, not of consolation, but of clarity. You weren't wrong to lead the way you did, but now the company needs something else. And the difference between legacy and liability is whether we know when to step back. She didn't respond. She left the room with her spine straight but her breath uneven. And for the first time in her career, she realized she wasn't walking toward her next opportunity, she was walking away from the last one that truly belonged to her. Karen Larson's final day in her formal role did not look like a farewell. There were no speeches, no send-offs, no carefully worded LinkedIn posts announcing a new chapter. Instead, there was a quiet withdrawal that happened not in ceremony, but in increments, like a room slowly losing its furniture until all that remained was the outline of what used to be. Her office was not reassigned but reclassified. The title on her door was changed in the system before the plaque outside was ever replaced. Her email signature updated itself. Her calendar invitations began to disappear, one by one, not canceled, just omitted. It was not exile. It was absorption, soft and irreversible. She arrived at the office that morning with the same posture she'd always had, shoulders squared, heels measured, face unreadable, but the badge scan felt different. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in silence. No greeting from the receptionist, no head nods in the hallway. People weren't ignoring her. They were just done reacting. She was no longer a storm to brace for. She had become a stillness that others moved around. Nicholas Foster hadn't spoken to her since their meeting, and he didn't need to. His presence remained a constant, not as a threat, but as an inevitable conclusion. He wasn't visible every day, but his fingerprints were everywhere, in new processes, in revised team structures, in the language of memos that emphasized horizontal clarity and shared leadership. He had quietly filled the space she used to dominate, not by replacing it, but by redesigning it so it no longer needed someone like her at the center. The most brutal part was that it worked. That afternoon, she sat in what was now designated her transition suite, a neutral space 2 floors down from where she had once commanded weekly operations. It was smaller, with muted walls and a desk that didn't quite fit her old rhythm. She stared at a blank page on her screen for 20 minutes, then typed a single line, "Legacy is not a guarantee of relevance." Then she deleted it. Outside her office, a conversation was happening, a conversation that had once belonged to her. A group of new team leads were being briefed on an upcoming phase of the company's structural audit. One of them mentioned Nicholas by name, not with awe but with fluency, as if he was now a permanent fixture of the organization's architecture. It wasn't the mention that stung, it was the normalcy of it. He was no longer the anomaly, he was the standard. Later that day, a message pinged in her inbox. It was from Nicholas. Short, professional, and almost sterile. "There's an executive debrief scheduled for 3 p.m. in CR1. Your presence is welcome, though optional." She stared at the words, dissecting their neutrality. It was not a summons. It was an invitation, one that acknowledged her existence but not her importance. At 2:58, she walked into CR1. The room was different than she remembered. Same walls, same table, but a different energy. The people seated around the table weren't the old guard. They were a blend of emerging leadership and cross-functional anchors, people who hadn't risen through hierarchy but had arrived through relevance. Nicholas sat at the head of the table, not because he demanded it, but because the room naturally formed around him. He greeted her with a nod. No flourish, no wait, just acknowledgement. The meeting began with a breakdown of ongoing initiatives, vendor realignment, onboarding overhauls, internal rotation programs. Karen listened, noting the efficiency, the clarity. No one was posturing. No one was protecting territory. The language was direct. The focus was collective. At one point, a junior lead made a comment that contradicted a long-standing logistics principle Karen herself had once written into protocol. No one noticed. No one defended the old model. The suggestion was discussed, adjusted, and accepted. The protocol she had written no longer held the floor. When the meeting ended, people lingered not to compete for face time but to finish conversations. Karen remained seated, unsure why. Nicholas stayed too. Eventually, the room emptied. He stood, walked over to where she sat, and placed a folder on the table. "I thought you might want a copy of the transition review," he said. "It includes your department's legacy systems, the migration map, and recommendations. Your name's attached to the historical framework appendix." She opened the folder, glanced through the pages. Everything was clean. Efficient. Her work wasn't erased, it was archived, categorized, labeled with neutral precision. Like a monument in a museum. Important but untouchable. "Is this how it ends?" she asked finally, not with bitterness, but with quiet exhaustion. "You come in, restructure everything, and move forward while we fade into historical footnotes?" Nicholas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm but sincere. "It's not an end, it's a pivot. What you built gave the company its durability. But durability without adaptability becomes drag. We didn't erase your work, we built on it." She closed the folder. "You speak like someone who's never had to lose something they owned." "I didn't own this place either," he replied. "But I did watch it from the outside for a long time, and I saw what power looks like when it forgets how it earned its place." Karen looked up, met his eyes. "And you think I forgot? I think you stopped evolving, and the company couldn't afford that anymore." There was no cruelty in his words. That was what made them harder to bear. As she stood to leave, Nicholas didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a farewell. He simply nodded again, and she walked out of the room that had once echoed her voice for years. The door clicked shut behind her, and she stood in the hallway, not paralyzed, just still. She made her way back to the suite. She sat down at the desk again. The screen was still blank. This time she typed another sentence. "I was not wrong. I was just no longer necessary." She didn't delete it. Outside her window, The city moved the same as it always had, but she was no longer part of the current. She was watching it from the shore. And Nicholas Foster, once the intern no one had time for, was already somewhere downstream, building the next version of what she used to lead. 3 months later, Karen Larson no longer entered the Braemon Logistics building through the executive entrance. Her badge still worked, but the routine had changed. She no longer arrived before everyone else, no longer held morning briefings, no longer reviewed departmental metrics before most employees poured their coffee. She still came in 3 days a week now, but through the general entrance, dressed slightly more casually, carrying a slim tablet instead of thick briefing folders. Her new title, Strategic Legacy Advisor, appeared in the staff directory in a font no bolder than that of a junior analyst. She had no direct reports, no team. Her job was to oversee the integration of long-standing systems into newer frameworks, catalog processes that had once formed the spine of Braemon's logistics model, and identify what could be preserved for archival, not operational use. She worked alone. She had adjusted, in her own way. There was no point in resisting. The transformation she once viewed as temporary had fully solidified. The company had indeed shifted. Leadership now operated laterally. Collaboration was not a buzzword but an actual practice, and decisions were made with consensus across functions, rather than dictated by individual dominance. What had once sounded to her like idealistic chaos had somehow become effective structure. Karen didn't understand it at first, how people with less authority managed to move so efficiently, but over time, she saw the mechanics. The culture Nicholas Foster had helped instill didn't rely on fear or legacy. It relied on shared visibility and quiet accountability. No one chased credit, but no one could hide. And in that clarity, something strange had emerged: progress. Karen watched it happen, not from above, but from the periphery. The Transformation Committee concluded its work and disbanded, leaving behind a framework that no longer required oversight. Nicholas, true to his nature, didn't consolidate power. Instead, he quietly receded from the daily front lines, assuming a more abstract role on the governance board. He no longer visited the floors regularly. His name stopped appearing on memos. But his influence remained embedded in the operating model like a new spine replacing the old one. People still invoked his principles, still referenced his guidelines. But they didn't defer to him like a leader. They built on what he left, making it their own. For Karen, the final stage of acceptance came the day she was asked to present at the internal onboarding series, a quiet request from HR to speak about the history of operations at Braemon and the lessons of procedural continuity. It was a symbolic gesture, but not an empty one. The audience was small, mostly new hires, mid-level staff, and a few senior observers, but they listened. And when she spoke, it wasn't with authority, but with reflection. She talked about scale, about the cost of growth, about the danger of mistaking habit for strategy. She didn't mention Nicholas by name, but she spoke of change as something necessary, not hostile. When she finished, there was light applause. No standing ovation, just polite appreciation. And that, for the first time, felt appropriate. After the session, she returned to her desk and found an envelope placed neatly on the table. There was no name, just her initials. Inside was a simple note, handwritten in clear, deliberate script: "We build things that work until they don't. Then we either change them or we let them bury us. You chose the first. That matters." NF. There was no signature beyond that. No request. No follow-up. Just a quiet acknowledgement from the man who had once sat as the invisible intern she'd dismissed without thought. She folded the note, placed it in the drawer with the rest of her archived materials, and closed it. There was nothing more to say. Outside, the company moved on. Systems evolved. Names rotated. Projects launched and concluded. Karen Larson remained, not as a shadow of the past, but as a preserved fragment, a part of the company's memory, not its momentum. Her relevance had shifted from command to context. And that, she finally accepted, was not a failure. It was a form of completion. There would be no return to her former role, no reversal, no sudden redemption arc. The story had run its course, and as she turned off her monitor and stood from her desk that evening, she didn't feel diminished. She felt done. Behind her, the lights of the office dimmed one by one. Ahead, the elevator doors opened without sound. And with that, Karen Larson left the building not defeated, not erased, but finally undeniably finished.